So I wanted to walk you back a little bit because this is not something that was just based on like anecdotal evidence or just our particular instincts. When we started this project, we really wanted to back it up with some real data and background information. I'll walk you through this crazy chart here. We took data from thousands of venture-backed companies and just ran it and asked a whole lot of questions of this data and trying to just see what kind of patterns we could get out of it. And we ran across this one thing that we thought was kind of interesting, but we didn't quite know what it meant, but we'll get to that in a second. But what this ends up showing is that when we looked at the value created by venture-backed companies after they went public, post-IPO value, we noticed this pattern that if companies that went public before they were 6 years old, the trend line basically had them dropping in value from IPO time to after the post-IPO value tended to go negative. Companies that went public between 6 and 10 years old created enormous post-IPO value. And companies that went public after they were 10 years old tended to basically flatline. Didn't really lose value, they didn't really excite anybody either. And we wondered what this meant. We took it to places like Morgan Stanley and JP Morgan, the investment bankers there, and we said, we showed them this, and they said, this matches our instincts, this matches what we see. We never ran the data, but actually it's really interesting that, this kind of proves out, but kind of makes sense to us. But they didn't know why this was happening either. So we went searching, and we ran the next step when we asked why this was happening. Oh, by the way, yeah, here's just as a little reminder of that 6 to 10, some of the biggest successes. Facebook went public at 8 years, Amazon at 8 years, Salesforce at 6. Uber in 2018 is 9 years old, so it suggests that if they go public in a year and a half, just don't buy the stock. So we asked, why is this happening? And that led us to the work of an economist named Paul Gorosky. And Paul Gorosky studied category life cycles. And he ended up creating this very simple chart that has 2 steps to it, and I'll walk you through each one. So the first step is and this makes intuitive sense if you think about it. When a new category gets identified, and you're down here basically, and one company or 2 companies figure out that there's some new invention, some new cool thing to do, there's hardly any companies in a space. As soon as, think back to that chart with like a zillion companies on it, as soon as it starts to be identified that it's interesting space, zillions of companies jump in, right? You get this spike in the number of companies in the space, and then you get this time period when the number of companies starts to drop off because 1 or 2 kings solidify. They either acquire some of the other companies in the space or the other companies go out of business. And so the number of companies in that category starts to fall into a smaller number. And then over time, it kind of flatlines. It kind of stabilizes at a few companies that are dominating that space. The other half of the curve goes like this, which is when a category is created, obviously it's worth pretty much nothing. And it takes a while for people to get the idea and it start to have some real value to that category. And then all of a sudden it catches on and it spikes. The total value of that category starts to spike. And over time it matures and levels off. So Gorosky put these together and created this chart of what a category life cycle looks like. And as you can imagine, the value is still climbing. The number of companies pile in, even though the value is not there. Suddenly the category catches on, king emerges, and it consolidates. But the category is actually taking off now and spiking. And then you get to some place where there's 2 or 3 companies dominating, and the category is pretty much mature and flatlining. And as you can probably tell, when you look at that chart and you say, well, that kind of overlaps to this. And it makes some sense because in this particular phase, the category is very uncertain and who's going to be the king is very uncertain. So you get situations like Groupon going public when it was 3 years old, and you've got a category that looked really promising but ended up not being so promising, and a company that went public at a huge valuation and ended up tanking afterwards. In this particular time period, you end up with 1 or 2 companies emerging that seem like they're going to be the obvious kings of this spiking category, and investors are very excited. That's when you want to put money in a company, and so the value starts to climb because it's got a lot of upside. And then in this last phase over here, what tends to happen is that as the category sort of matures and flatlines and the number of players consolidates, it's all of the excitement is out of it. It's just basically a mature stock at play at that point. So that's why when companies go public when they're late, it doesn't do bad, it doesn't do good. It's just that all of the information is already there, right? You're not really like investing in something that's going to spike.